Welcome, amazing listeners, friends, to the Hopeful Majority. This is episode 64. The question that I've got today is, what actually is the office of the citizen? I hear a lot of political leaders, people these days talking about the importance of being a citizen, getting active, and yet there's also a lot of cynicism and apathy out there. And frankly, I think a lot of us are just sitting there throwing up our hands, being like, yo, we can't actually create progress or change. We can't get involved. Things seem so complicated. It's much easier to bury your heads in the phone. I know that feeling. And so today I've got on a fascinating guest named Sam Daley-Harris, who's committed his career. He was active from the 70s to today, who founded a couple of different large scale nonprofits, organizations, citizen lobbies, as he would call them. He also co founded the Microcredit Summit campaign in 1995 with a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Muhammad Yunus, who you may have heard of. And he's someone that wrote this book called The Reclaiming Our Democracy, which I found fascinating. It sort of describes what it actually means to activate your power as a citizen. And again, I get it. Talking about activating power, talking about change, a lot of it feels cliche in this world. And the episode's a little bit different than our general themes, but I think it's useful because he describes, I think, Sam, a lot of different ways in which we as people that are listening to the show can actually start to take real positive steps towards trying to realize the world that we live in. Because I think these days, a lot of people have just given in and given up. And I think when people give in and give up, you don't really have an active, productive democracy because democracy requires active, vibrant citizens. So, with that, let's explore what actually is the office of the citizen. Let's welcome Sam Daley-Harris to the show. Sam Daley-Harris, welcome to the Hopeful Majority, sir.
It's great to be here.
Well, I'll just say that I've been wrestling a lot recently with the question of apathy and cynicism. And in fact, one of the previous guests on the show, a person named Andrew Yang, he ran for presidential politics on the Democratic side. He had this fascinating statement, which was that democracies like the United States oftentimes don't end with a bang, but they slump into authoritarianism. And a big focus of your book and your life has been focused on how to get people to activate and become active citizens. So, could you explain a little bit of how you've approached this question of apathy and cynicism throughout your career and why you think people are particularly susceptible today?
Well, let me share this little snippet of a quote that I share all the time. It's from Alex Steffen, futurist and climate activist. He said, in fact, these days, cynicism is obedience. Well, yeah, if I'm cynical, I'm obedient to the way things are. I'm not going to do anything. Why would I if nothing I do makes a difference? And so I just love the way and this is part of a much larger quote I could share later if you want. Um, but so my whole world is about building structures of support whereby I, as a volunteer, or you as a volunteer, could come into this structure and getting help at chipping away at the cynicism. Let me share this one other quote. It's actually a conversation. I was talking to the head of organizing for several years ago, a really large nonprofit. Everyone would know this group's name. And he said to me, we can't let our volunteers write letters to the editor or op-eds because they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. So protecting the brand is more important than empowering the volunteers. In one of the groups I coached for the first 7 years, Citizens Climate Lobby, in 2019, their volunteers had 4,300 letters to the editor, op-eds, and editorials published. So one group's saying they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. This other group is saying, well, what do we have to do to help them get it right and give that to them? So talk about cynicism. If I'm in an organization that doesn't trust me and won't train me, I guess, that would actually bring the cynicism on big time.
So cynicism is obedience. That, especially to some of the younger people, I think they shirk at this idea of obeying. And I think it's fascinating to convey in that standpoint of, by giving in, you're actually obeying the rules of the system that you're in. So you laid out this fascinating statement, which is that your focus is building structures that regular everyday people like you and I can plug into to take action. Tell me how you got to that from where you actually started. What's a little bit of your journey? Because for the audience's context, this is the first
Yeah.
time you and I are meeting as well. So I'm curious.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an odd story, but I'll share it in a moment. But Marshall Gans calls it the story of self. What
Okay.
happened in your life and what decisions did you make that got you to this commitment? So when I tell my story of self, I really urge people to think about theirs. I mean, have you not written it down yet? You have it, but you hardly ever share it. You share it all the time. Think about what yours is, not just listening to mine. So I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in music, and I played percussion instruments in the Miami Philharmonic Orchestra for 12 years and taught high school music. And 44 years ago, I founded the anti-poverty lobby. Results in a lot of time I'm asked, music, poverty lobby, what's the connection there? And when I look back in my life, there's certain experiences that start pointing me in a different direction. The death of a friend around high school graduation in 1964 and the assassination of US Senator Robert Kennedy around college graduation in 1968 got me to asking the questions of purpose. Why am
Mm,
I here? What am I here to do? What's my purpose? 9 years later, 1977, I'm invited to a presentation on ending world hunger put on by the Hunger Project. And I go to this event thinking, well, hunger's inevitable. What do I know? I'm a musician. I mean, I'm thinking it's inevitable because there must be no solutions, because if there were solutions, somebody would have done something by now. But I go to the event and it's obvious right away there's no mystery to growing food, clean water, basic health, literacy. I'm not hopeless about the perceived lack of solutions. I'm hopeless about human nature, people
mm,
will just never get around to doing the things that can be done. But there's one human nature I have some control over, my own, and my questions. Why am I here? What am I here to do? So I get involved in a big way. This is the end of the story. In 1978, 1979, I spoke to 7,000 high school students, classroom by classroom, on ending world hunger. And before I went into the first classroom, I read some statements from Jimmy Carter's Commission on World Hunger, calling for the political will
mm.
to end hunger. So I asked 7,000 high school students, you talk about cynicism today. I asked 7,000 high school students in the late 70s what the name of their member of Congress was. I didn't want to know if they'd written them or met, just the name. Out of 7,000 students asked, 200, fewer than 3%, could tell me the name of their member of Congress. 6,800, over 97%, couldn't tell me the name of their member of Congress. And results, the anti poverty lobby I founded
Mm.
grew out of this gap between the calls for the political will to end hunger on the one hand and the lack of basic information on who represented us in Washington on the other. We didn't exactly work with young people at that time, but I learned this gap out of that question I asked. And I'll tell you one last thing. So I'm shifting from musician to activist. And there's a quote from Buckminster Fuller, the inventor
Mhm.
and futurist, who said, the things to do are the things that need doing, that you see need to be done, and that no one else seems to see needs to be done. Well, when I asked 7,000 students the name of their member of Congress and fewer than 3% could answer correctly, I saw something that
Mm.
needed to be done that not too many others seem to see yet. And then I talked to a lot of people.
You know what's fascinating about that story, Sam, is that it it really resonates with the way that things started for me. So I'll tell you what, I hear sort of three things in your story. One is this element of uncertainty about purpose. The second is finding purpose. And the third is just a spontaneous sort of event that you found yourself at that connected with a bunch of different things that then you saw align. And as I told you in the pre-prep of this, I started off as a pre-med student. My mom is still confused. She's like, what is this guy up to? I was interested in trying to be a doctor. And then we had these giant protests on campus. And me and some random friends got together and we wanted to create a space for dialogue. And that was sort of one of the original Bridge USA chapters. So very sort of similar story in the arc of uncertainty. And so before we even get to some of the substance around citizen lobbies and what it means to actually hold the office of citizen, which is a question that I think a lot about. I'm just curious, you use this phrase, the story of writing your story of life, and you used this phrase of finding your purpose. Um, what is your advice to somebody listening right now about how they can start to think about their purpose
Yeah.
at a time when it feels like a lot of people lack a sense of purpose and
Yeah.
community?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, just through the story of self, in the book, I talk about knowing your why and sharing it, kind of thing. And it was Marshall Gans who developed the story of self. What happened in your life? What decisions did you make that got you to this commitment? So now to your question about purpose,
Hmm.
my main answer is stay open, pay attention.
Hmm.
It's not like, "Oh, you have till Friday to find your
Yeah.
purpose." No, 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 no.
Yeah.
Just pay attention, you know, absorb, way back in the '70s when when I was, like, younger kind of thing, I would listen to lectures by Ram Dass and by, Leo Buscaglia and by, Dick Gregory and,
Hmm.
just kind of like staying open and paying attention. You never
And saying
know.
yes to
Yes,
opportunities.
exactly. You never know when that protest on campus will spur something. Just pay attention and that kind of thing. And also try and go deeper, in your reading or the videos you watch or
Mhm.
whatever it is, there's something deeper out there and
Mm.
kind of it's almost till the soil of you to
Right.
to be able to let sprout a
Yeah.
deeper purpose.
This is interesting that you bring up this idea of like tilling the soil of you and exploring and saying yes. I was just thinking about this the other day. Um, that I wonder from the 70s to now how much the introduction of technology and phones changes people's ability to be open-minded and actually pay attention to the
Mhm.
world around them. Like I'm curious what what your outlook is on the possibility of finding purpose when everybody's so glued into their phone. Do you think
Yeah,
it makes it actually easier because you got access to the world, you got access to information, you're connected
yeah,
to everybody, or do you think that it makes it much harder because in some ways you almost feel like you're looking at a bunch of zombies that are just zoned in on their
yeah,
technology and not focused on the world around them?
yeah. I can see how it could easily make it harder
Mhm.
because you're kind of drinking from the fire hose kind
Right.
of thing. But if you can do whatever you do, but also hone in on what inspires you, what moves you. What is it about that video or that TikTok or that something that inspires you and let yourself be led to inspiration among all
Mhm.
the fire hose is the only other way I would put it.
So I just want to ask one other question about sort of this subject of your early life to where you are in the arc, because I think that it really lays the foundation for how you think about the world and sort of the optimistic lens I think through which you operate. So y- you mentioned this arc where you are trying to find purpose and you're trying to write the story of your life and you're saying yes to opportunities and you're having a curious mind. Um, it seems like you're still that way, like, a long time afterwards. I
Yeah,
can tell even from this conversation, you're very energized, you care
yeah,
about your work, you're passionate. How have you kept the flame of purpose alive through the years of ups and
yeah,
downs, through the
yeah,
years of being tested? Because I think that that's the journey of a citizen. So
yeah.
how have you maintained
So
that?
my answer to that is that I was fortunate enough with others to stumble into a structure of support that allowed citizens to blossom. And so my inspiration and my enthusiasm comes from the fact that I actually get to look over there or wherever and see some citizens who are blossoming
Mm,
because they're in this structure of support. Let me say it another way. I did an op-ed in the Chicago Sun-Times this year, uh, and I interviewed a few volunteers, one from Results and two from Citizens Climate Lobby. I was inspired, and then I shared it's a similar beginning. I want to tell you about the beginning in a moment. In the Tennessean in Nashville,
mhm.
and I interviewed two other volunteers there inspired me. And now I have an op-ed I just submitted. He had invited me to write it um, in the New Jersey Spotlight. And I interviewed a volunteer in Results, Citizens Climate Lobby, the Quaker Lobby, FCNL, and Catholic Relief Services. And I was blown away by what these folks who joined groups that work to deliver transformational advocacy have done as citizens and as advocates. So I'm talking 2024, where I'm getting inspired right now by
Mhm.
these folks. Let me tell you just a little bit about the beginning of the op-ed. It's the same beginning, and then the stories of these volunteers. And I don't know if you know this artist, Eva Cassidy. She's a singer. It's
I am the most culturally out of tune person ever, so I'm
okay.
the wrong person to ask.
So
But I'm sure
Eva
somebody in the audience has heard of him.
So yes, yes, yes. And you should maybe we can put a little link to one of these
Sure.
op-eds that has links to her songs. Eva Cassidy, like on a day like today, where I had 8 meetings, when I want to calm down, I listen to Eva Cassidy singing "Fields of Gold," and she does this mind-blowing version of "Over the Rainbow." She's this amazing singer. Well, Eva Cassidy died at 34 in the 1990s from a cancer. And in this beginning of this op-ed, I say the 6 weeks before she died, the artists around her, she was unknown except for where she lived, put on a benefit concert to
Mm,
pay for her bills. And she took extra morphine to ease the pain. At the end of the night, she was helped on stage and she sang one song, What a Wonderful World. Rather
mhm,
than the pain and the despair and the anger. Uh, 6 weeks before she dies, the last song she sings on stage was What a Wonderful World.
mm.
And I write in the op ed, what if our politics could come from a similar place of gratitude and a similar place of grace? And then I talk about transformational advocacy allows for that gratitude and grace, where volunteers, rather than being completely bummed and discouraged, you know, kind of open themselves up to the difference that they can make.
This makes me think of the fact that last year the U.S. Surgeon General, and we've referenced this in a lot of past conversations, came out with a report that said the national epidemic in the United States, and you may have seen this, is not obesity or heart disease or climate issues. It's loneliness. And if I come my family comes from India. If you went to my village in India, you said the biggest problem in the United States is loneliness, they would be like, what's going on in your society? What are you missing out on? Right? What's going on? And you mentioned this phrase, "What a wonderful world," something that this Eva Cassidy sings at the end, and I can imagine that we live at this moment where there's a lot of material prosperity and progress, especially in the United States, across a lot of communities, and yet the challenge is loneliness. And you described that what has been key to your inspiration over the years is being connected to a community, right? To a community of citizens. How important do you think it is for people to be engaged in their communities, to have relationships, to maintain that sort of sense of hope and optimism?
Yep.
Because otherwise you're just in your phone all the time and all
Yep.
you see is the negativity out there.
So let me tell you if you're looking for a group that delivers or works to deliver transformational advocacy, you're
Hmm.
looking for three things. But let me describe what transformational is, and then I'll describe the three things. The first of which is community, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, most everyone knows transactional, sign the petition, transaction complete,
Right.
transactional advocacy. But with transformational advocacy, you're trained, encouraged, and then succeed at doing things as an advocate you never thought you could do, like meeting with a member of Congress and bringing them on board to your issue, or
Hmm.
writing a letter to the editor on an issue you care about, and having it published, kind of thing. So that's the trend. That's the change where you see
The
yourself.
distinction between transformational and
Yeah,
transactional.
because you see yourself in a new light. You see yourself differently. A transformation has taken place. I'll tell you some volunteer stories later.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But
Yeah.
but when you're looking for a group, thing one that the group does is recruitment and community building. They bring new people in, not just to build an e-blast list, but forming local chapters so you're
Hmm.
not working on your own. And then the community building, the group might have a monthly webinar with guest speakers and Q&A and inspiration. Recruitment, that's your toward your antidote to loneliness, and community building. Two is training. How
Hmm.
do you get the meeting with the elected? How do you plan for the meeting? What do you ask for in the meeting? How do you write a letter to training? Three, the organization encourages breakthroughs. They encourage you to do things you never thought you could do. And so it's interesting. You raise the Surgeon General and the issue of loneliness. Well, the first ingredient of a group that's working to deliver transformational advocacy is bringing people together
Right, and meeting
physically.
that need, and meeting that need. So I know we're jumping to the advocacy and to what it is, and we haven't laid the foundation fully. So I want to take a
Good.
quick step back
Yep.
because uh, the audience that's listening right now, Sam, they're thinking, all right, we've talked about community, we've talked about relationships, we've talked about your story, and you're talking about this advocacy thing. Can you draw the link between, and there's actually a line in your book, it says citizens awakening to their own power, that in fact the thesis of the book is that you can be a deep advocate and experience the joy and power of being a deep advocate. Why do you see advocacy as an important part of finding joy in life? Why is advocacy something that everybody should do? Because when people listen to this, and it's a pretty wide audience, there's some STEM and business people here that are like, Manu, why are we talking about being advocates? I'm just trying to work my 9 to 5 job and I want my family.
Yeah.
What's the power of advocacy for
Yeah.
you?
The power of advocacy is the power to be a change maker.
Hmm.
I don't mean you single-handedly change the world kind of thing, but it is quite demonstrable that where you are with your newspaper and the letters that are published or the op-eds, where you are with your member of Congress, or that you are a change maker, that
Hmm.
you change things. And so I want my life to matter. And of course, it matters in my home, in my family. It matters on my block. Let's say it matters in my community. Do I have to stop there?
Hmm.
Can I make it matter and demonstrate that it matters, in the nation and in the world, kind of thing? And so, why advocacy is because it is a vehicle,
Hmm.
if you're given the right tools, to creating a more perfect union.
Hmm.
It is a means, a method, a tool, a gift, really, to making change that you want
So
to.
this might sound like a very rudimentary question, but it's a question I get asked a lot, which is when I'm especially on the road, which is, you're making the case for making your life matter outside of the context of your family and your community to the nation. My life is perfectly fine the way it is. Why should I care about the nation when everything around me is doing just fine? When my
Yeah,
needs are being met?
yeah.
Why should I care?
So here's the deal. I don't, the listeners, I don't know what touches their heart, for example. But I could say, well, my life is fine. I mean, why should I bother? Because things are hunky dory right now. But I'll give you one example. When 20 first graders were killed and 6 teachers in Connecticut some years ago, the grief that I felt
This is the
about,
Sandy Hook
yes,
massacre that you're
exactly.
referring to.
The grief that I felt, I didn't have words for now. So I'm thinking the people who come up to you when you're doing your talks on the road, I don't know what it is that touches them so deeply. And my thing is, don't do this and this and this and no, focus.
Hmm.
You might love 10 issues, but go deep on one,
Mm.
and trust that others will go up deep on some of the other 9. But,
Hmm.
I would say to a person who says, my life is lovely, it's hunky dory, why should I work to change the nation or the world? And I would say that somewhere deeper, you know, uh, I don't know if it was George Floyd. I just don't know what it might be for someone that actually does it move you and then you stuff it? Does
Hmm.
it move you and then you shut it down? My life is fine. No, no reason to make change. Or do you open yourself up to it? And
Hmm.
frankly, then find an organization that builds community training and breakthroughs.
That's interesting. So I can almost see, because I think everybody listening has experienced something in their life where they're sitting and watching the news, or they're hearing a story from their friend or for their family member, and they say that thing really grips me, right? It strikes me with grief or anger or frustration the same way
Yeah,
that something like the Sandy Hook
yeah,
massacre did for you.
yeah,
And so the way to think about, your book and your guide is, how do you translate that grief into action as opposed to just suppressing it? Because to your point, we have to do something about it.
yeah.
Is that the right way to think about it and frame it?
Absolutely. Yep. Completely.
So when I'm getting started, let's say I'm a citizen and I'm in my apartment, and an issue strikes me, and I'm like, I want to do something about it. I know that you've outlined a pathway in your book to going about and figuring it out, but what would your advice be to somebody that's just wanting to get involved in something? How
Yeah.
should they go about that process? Because that was a process that you went on.
Right. So here's the thing. I'm not sure if in the program notes we can put there's a participation form that where people could let me know, well, I'm interested in poverty, I'm interested in climate, I'm interested in peace issues, and that I could help link them to an
Okay.
organization. Because you can read the book. I love the book, but it's not quite the same as being in a community, being with others in a community that really trains you and really encourages breakthroughs. And so I would really encourage one of our viewers or listeners um, to find one of these groups that really
Mhm.
doesn't say they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization, but says, what do we have to do to help them get it right and give that to them that really encourages you and trains you?
So there's a phrase that you use a lot called citizens awakening to their power.
Yep.
What is a citizen's power?
Well, let me give you an example.
Sure.
In the book, I write about a woman. Her name is Ellie Sparks. And when I'm writing about her, she's a volunteer. She's now on staff at Citizens Climate Lobby. I've got a bunch of these stories. And she said to me, before I joined CCL, I was suffering from climate trauma. I would read Bill McKibben's book, Earth, and I would weep at home and I would weep at work. Then she joins Citizens Climate Lobby, gets training, she has a community. And at the end of 18 months, she goes to 20 congressional meetings over 4 days.
Hmm.
And at the end of those 20 congressional meetings, she describes that experience. She said, going into their offices was hard. I had to let go of a lot of emotional baggage. I could no longer judge them or hold hostility in my heart toward them. I had to let go of my fear of climate change and my fear that they wouldn't listen to me. I had to center myself in love. Releasing fear and centering in love, this is sacred and profound work. End of quote. I'm blown away that I remember the whole
Mhm.
quote. So she went from climate trauma to sacred and profound. And so that is the journey. That is the transformation from
Mhm.
climate trauma in that her case to what she called an experience that was sacred and profound. Letting go of fear, centering self in love. She went to all the congressional offices in Virginia in her case, and plus some others. So there was a lot of letting go of fear in going into and centering in love, going into those offices.
Mhm. Mhm. And she was an everyday citizen that had the capacity to act just like you and I.
Yep.
And where my mind goes with a lot of this is that, and this is especially true, I would say, within the younger generation, Sam, but I think this is broadly the case, which is that today we live at a time when we're so divided and where things are so polarized and incredibly toxic that I find a lot of people lose their sense of love and care for their fellow neighbors and Americans and put their cause above them. Now, some could say that's a great thing. Fine, you care about the climate, care about it so much that when you come across somebody that disagrees with your solutions, screw with them, go on your path of advocacy. And yet, I've also noticed a deep level of corrosion of the American soul because people are getting active in ways in which they're deprioritizing their relationships and they find that their cause is more important than their fellow American.
Yep.
How do you wrestle and balance those two
Well,
competing forces?
you have to choose. You have to choose. I mean, I'm not saying, well, if you go that route, you know, uh, the combative route, that's a
Mhm.
mistake. That's not my route. I don't know. I could have lasted 44 years from founding results to today with the combative route. So let me give you an example of
Please.
the other route. So when I'm coaching a group that's meeting with a member of Congress who opposes their bill, I have them ask three questions. Question one, and you're listening for assignments. Question one, we know you don't support this bill. What would it take to change your mind? Question two, could you say more about that? Question three, why do you think that is? And so I have this friend in Pennsylvania who wanted to start it. He's chapter 2 in the book. Um, he wanted to start a climate solutions caucus. He was a volunteer also.
Mhm.
Um, and he knew that in South Florida, where sea level was rising and there were Republican and Democrat members of Congress, he would make flights down to Florida to look for his lead Republican and his lead Democrat in what would be a climate solutions caucus. And it took him nearly 3 years. And he meets with a member of Congress who says, he said, what would it take to change your mind? The member says, well, if you could get the chambers of commerce on board listening for assignments. And he did Miami, Miami Beach, Coral Gables, South Miami, Hialeah. It comes back to the congressman with letters from the chambers of commerce. And the congressman said, well, if you could get the mayors on board, and he did, Miami, Miami Beach,
Yeah.
Coral Gables, South Miami. And the Climate Solutions Caucus started in 2016. And by the end of that year, it had grown to 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats because it was sort of a Noah's Ark. A Republican couldn't come out on without a Democrat and vice versa. And then President Donald Trump was elected president, and it's shrunk to 6 and 6 because some members had lost their race or were retired. By the end of President Trump's second year in office, it had grown to 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats. Now, I'm not overstating, I don't want to overstate what a climate solutions caucus could do. But all of a sudden, where he started 3 years earlier, oh, don't use the word climate. You won't get that party on board if you have climate in the title. to where there were 45 Republicans and 45
Hmm.
Democrats in the Climate Solutions Caucus. And that was an example of, we know you don't support this bill. What would it take to change your mind? Rather than, well, this guy's a Neanderthal. There's no reason to meet with them. No, 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 no.
Hmm.
Or, oh, my member of Congress is a big supporter. There's no reason to meet with them. No, no, no. You want to move a supporter, don't take a nap. You want to move a supporter up to being an advocate or a leader or someday a champion
Hmm.
on your issue. So that's an example of opposed,
Hmm.
don't quit. Supporter, don't stop. You want to move them. We call it the champion scale, moving those opposed up to neutral,
Hmm.
neutral up to supporters, supporters up to advocates, to leaders, and then eventually to champions.
That's fascinating that those are three questions that anybody can use, regardless of what thing that they are interested in, what bill they're focused on, left,
Yeah.
right, it doesn't matter, that you can deploy as an actual framework to talk to members of Congress, to talk to senators, to talk to different folks.
And it's a listening framework.
Yes,
It's,
it's a listening and actually, I mean, the 3 questions you said, which are essentially, tell me about how I can start to shift your mind without actually saying, "Tell me how I can shift
yeah,
your mind." Those questions you can ask to your family members, your relatives. Just today in the
yeah,
morning, I was writing responses for Time Magazine about, like, how can you talk to your relatives that whose political views you hate, right? And
yeah,
part of that is show up not to argue,
yeah.
but to listen and hear, which
And
seems yeah,
a lot of it lives in, can you say more about that?
right, right, or
Why
tell
do
me
you
more.
think that is? Tell
Right.
me more. Tell me more, basically.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep. Tell me more. And yet it feels like a lot of people are so impatient that they want to choose the combative route because in some ways that seems to be the dominant model of change. Like you grew up in the 60s, the 70s as core of your formation. And in those times, the models of change that were heralded were the Gandhis of the world, the Dr. Kings of the world, Nelson Mandela in the 90s. And today I find that the models of change that are more championed are the zero sum, I win, you lose model.
yeah,
Because it feels like people have just given hope in the capacity for changing people's minds.
yeah, yeah. So,
Why do you
it's
think
a
that
choice.
is?
Well,
I
again,
what because you've engaged and thought a lot about how to create changing it citizens active. Like why has it become so that
okay,
people are
here's
much
my
afraid?
okay. So, if we don't learn civics in high school or middle school, if we don't learn the working together part there, I say the place we're going to learn it is from our nonprofits and the nonprofit organizations. And so let me give you some statistics on
Please.
nonprofits. There was a study in 2023 by the independent sector that found that 31% of nonprofits were doing lobbying or advocacy in the last 5 years, which was less than half of those doing it in the year 2000. So the number of nonprofits doing advocacy has shrunk.
Mhm.
Okay, it gets worse. Hold on. The Congressional Management Foundation did a survey of grassroots advocacy professionals, and they asked the grassroots advocacy professionals what their primary tactic was. And 79% said an email form letter.
Hmm.
Give them your name and your zip code, and we'll send the letter for you. 79% said an email form letter was their primary tactic, but only 3% of congressional staff said an email form letter was highly effective in affecting their office's decisions, the member of Congress's decisions. 94% of congressional staff said an in person issue visit from a constituent is either effective or highly effective.
Hmm.
But we're not being trained to do an in person issue visit by a constituent. We're trained to do an email form letter.
Hmm.
So we're being asked to do what only 3% of congressional staff says is highly effective. See, you want to know why this is happening. And I'm going to get to my punchline now. For me, it's the fear of nonprofits, staff mostly, fear of making big asks of volunteers. So I'm going to give you one example. I was coaching a guy from Seattle. His organization was having their first ever monthly webinar, and he was going to do what we call a grassroots victory. And so I was prepping him, and he said, well, we're only 2 or 3 months old, our chapter, but we've already met with 4 state legislators, 2 state reps, and 2 state senators. This was in Washington. And one of our state reps is the chair of the Committee on Energy and Environment. Oh, and their issue was carbon removal, not just getting to net zero emissions, but removing the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And he said the chair of the committee asked us to do a briefing for him and his committee staff. And I said, well, wait, whoa. You've had 4 meetings with elected officials in 2 or 3 months. Had you ever met with an elected official before? He said, no, this was the first time for me. I said, well, had you ever written to an elected? He said, I'd never written, I'd never called, I'd never met with. This was the first time I'd ever done any of this. I said, put that in your talk, because people are going to think he's an expert. I'm not an expert. He could do it. No, you've never done this before. Tell people that you've never done it. The point was, he was in a chapter that started with a 4-part new group training, 90 minutes for 4 sessions. How do you get the meeting? What do you ask for in the meeting? How do you plan for the meeting? And they'd had 4 meetings. Well, most organizations wouldn't start a chapter to begin with, sad to say.
That's
And
right.
if they they wouldn't start with a 4-part new group training. And if they did, it might be a boring training, I
Well,
don't know, kind of thing. And so it was this organization, lack of fear. Oh, they may have had some, but fear of making big asks of volunteers, because a 4-part new group training is a big ask. What if there are 20 in the room and I'm going to ask them to start with a 4-part? Maybe nobody's going to raise their hand. Maybe no one's going to say, I'll be in this chapter if I ask too much. No, au contraire. You need to ask something big, but you need to then deliver. You can't just
So
ask for a lot and deliver baloney.
I think a lot of this resonates with me. For context, again, I lead an organization called Bridge USA. We have college and high school chapters across the country,
Yeah.
and I know exactly what you're getting at. I fear that you've made a very strong case for what is a citizen and the importance of advocacy, and yet I think a lot of it these days falls on deaf ears, because I think the average person that's sitting there simply just throws up their hand and says, I don't have time for this. And I know you've heard this. So here's what I want to wrap the conversation with. The biggest question I hear again on the road is someone telling me, I really appreciate your message, but I don't have the time. I got kids to take care of. I got families to take care of. I'm not some, single person that can get out there and go to the Hill and go talk to members of Congress. That also sounds miserable to me. I'm making the case of the cynic to you because I want you to attack that case head
Yeah.
on. Because
Okay.
I think that is the foundational challenge of this book,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
that it matters, and yet how do you
Right.
reach the people that actually
Yeah.
need the change?
Yeah.
So, what is your response to somebody that says, I don't have the time to
Yeah.
care, advocate, or act?
I'm going to share a variation on that, and I'm going to get exactly your question. I was interviewed on 1A, which is an NPR show, nationwide kind of thing. This is question number 2, which is a variation on what you said. Let's get to, I don't have the time in a moment. He said, the passive nature to our politics now, you can feel beat down by it. I mean, this is my career and I feel beat down by it. It's much more of an effort for me. I don't participate in the same way others do because I'm a political journalist, but I do have to pay attention. It's a grind. It's a grind, Sam. I mean, I know you know that. What am I feeling? What is a way out of that? That agony about what's going on out there, into which I would easily say, I really don't have the time, really. I mean, I'm sorry. And I think part of what I don't have the time is I don't have the time for gestures. I don't have the time for frustration. I
Right.
don't have the time to spin my wheels, kind of thing. I used to be on the road in the early days of Results. A couple of airlines, one of them doesn't even exist anymore, used to offer 21 flights for $649 if you did them in 21 days. And I did 5 city trips. That's the whole thing. But I always had this rap. Someone come up to me and said, I have two little kids at home. And I was working on world hunger. I have two little kids at home. There's no way I could work on this right now. Someone else comes to me and says, I have two little kids at home. I've got to work on this. So it's first of all, if someone says I don't have the time, my question is the invitation deep and compelling?
Mm,
Is it something I'm drawn to? Like when I coach a group who already has a kind of, let's call it not that effective structure, and they bring me in to develop something much deeper, transformational advocacy. I say, no, 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 no. The old folks, don't make them come over here. Just develop something that's so enticing, that's so exciting, that the folks in the old structure go, I want, I want what they're having, kind of thing, because it's so inspiring. Yeah, if I don't have the time, I want to know what they're being invited into. And sure, it might be that out of 20 in the room, 10 don't have the time, and let's call it 10 do. Let those 10 do miracles, and you'll have
right.
some of the others come over and get involved.
So here's what we'll wrap with. I'll give you some context on why the show's called The Hopeful Majority, because I think it'll resonate with a little bit of what you're saying. So I think that the problem right now, a big part of the reason why I think we're incredibly divided is that you've got these really loud and active people. Is the people you're talking about that are very active, they're already involved, and they're very vocal. And then you got like this 90% of people that are just exhausted, quiet, often called the silent majority. Um, and they are scared to touch politics, or they don't want to touch politics, or they feel like it's not worth their time, to your point. And my entire contention is, if you call them the best way to get a bunch of exhausted people active is to call them the exhausted majority. Don't call them the exhausted majority. At least give them some hope, give them a sense of agency. So when you're thinking through expanding your message, when you're talking about trying to reclaim our democracy, how do you make a convincing case to somebody to tell them that their action, obviously it's not going to necessarily change the entire world, but that their action actually contributes to a positive step? What's your
Yeah.
case for that?
Well, let me do it two ways, one at the
Please.
individual level and one at the global level.
Absolutely.
When I go in that meeting with the member of Congress the first time, or aide, and maybe I'm just taking notes, and the second time, maybe I have a speaking role, I see something I see the change. When I write that first letter to the editor and it's not published, but my buddy in the chapter, hers was published, but my third one is published, I see change. I see, quote unquote, I'm making news. Maybe it's a little bit of news in a letter to the editor, but I'm not kind of like offended by the news or ignoring the news or accosted by the news. No, I'm making the news. So let me go a different direction. The anti-poverty lobby Results, which I founded 44 years ago, for the last 40 years, we've lobbied every year on child survival. When UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, was reporting in 84, 40,000 kids around the world were dying every day
Hmm.
from preventable things, measles, coupled with malnutrition. Results volunteers have lobbied every year on this and other things. The child survival, the death rate has fallen by 66% over those. You could say, well, why not 100%? Well, yeah, not 100, but from 40,000 child deaths a day
Wow.
to 13,800 a day. I remember a letter from the head of UNICEF in 1986. He wrote, I thank you in my mind at least weekly, if not more often, for what you and your colleagues are accomplishing. I thought I should do it at least once this year in writing, because in 86, the volunteers generated 90 editorials, not letters, but where the New York Times or the LA Times or the Miami Herald wrote an editorial supporting the tripling of the Child Survival Fund. So, I mean, that's where it, like, step back from the individual to 40 years of work can make this profound difference. And there's lots
And
of
it's
stories.
and it's much more than what would have happened if you never actually got off the couch and did something. I
Oh,
think
big
I
time.
think I think there's a lot of impatience, and I think people don't understand the long game, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I know that we're talking after a long day, but thank you for, I think, giving people a sense of what it means to actually occupy the office of the citizen.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming on the show, Sam.
Yeah. It's a thrill. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sam, for joining the Hopeful Majority. I appreciated his perspective. I hope you listening appreciated the way in which we operated on different levels of the conversation. I know some of it was a little nitty gritty, and I think some of it was at the weeds of how we actually act and talk to members of Congress. But I learned a lot. And if you appreciated this conversation, remember every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you got your content, we interview fascinating guests, presidential candidates, political leaders, activists, citizens across the political spectrum. And importantly, the goal is to actually have these productive dialogues and conversations. And you're actually making this possible. So I appreciate you tuning in. And I'll see you next week, Monday. Take care, everybody.